Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into the world of Carl Jung.
Oh, always a fascinating one.
Yeah, and specifically his ideas of the collective unconscious and archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be looking at a book called Mythos and Logos in the Thought of Carl Jung by Walter A Shelburne.
Okay.
And this was written in 1988.
Wow.
So, Jung, he was trying to bridge this gap between ancient myths and modern science.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah, it's a fascinating tension that he really grapples with in his work.
Yeah, I mean, how can we, in a modern world that's dominated by science, really take these ancient myths seriously?
Right.
Like, how do those two things go together?
Well, and that's where his idea of mythos and logos becomes so important, I think.
Yeah.
He doesn't see them as these two opposing forces.
Right.
You know, it's not like mythos is the realm of intuition and symbolic thinking.
Right.
And then logos is this cold, hard realm of rationality and science.
Right.
He sees them as complementary. It's like two sides of the same coin. You need both.
That's really interesting because I think so often we do kind of pit those two against each other.
We do.
Like it's either,
right.
The rational scientific viewpoint or it's the intuitive,
right.
Kind of spiritual.
And he's saying that that's a mistake.
Right.
That we actually need both of those things.
Yeah. So like what happens when we ignore that need for mythos, for that symbolic meaning?
Well, Jung would say it doesn't go away.
Right.
He would say that we might end up latching on to other belief systems.
Oh.
Even potentially harmful ones to fill that void.
Oh, interesting.
Like, think about it. Have you ever noticed in your own life or in the lives of people, you know how sometimes when people lose their connection to traditional religion, they might become almost fanatically devoted to a political ideology? Or a fringe group or some other system of belief.
Right, right.
It's like they're searching for that same sense of meaning.
Meaning, yeah.
And belonging that they might have gotten from religion.
Right.
But they're looking for it in maybe less healthy places.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point.
And Jung actually talks about this specifically.
Does he?
He talks about how sometimes you see people, they turn to political ideologies almost as a substitute for religion.
So interesting.
Because they need that
structure.
That structure, that sense of meaning.
Yeah, that symbolism.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that makes me think about his concept of, like dead religious symbols. Where he talks about like those religious symbols that maybe have become too literal, too devoid of depth.
They've lost their symbolic power.
Right.
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced that?
Oh, absolutely.
Where maybe a ritual or a symbol that used to be really meaningful to you now feels empty.
It's like the life has gone out of it. It's just an empty shell.
Yeah, yeah.
And Jung would say that that's because it's no longer connected to the unconscious. It's no longer tapping into that deeper level of meaning.
Right.
And that's what he sees as the real power of mythos.
Okay, so then how does that, then tie into the logos?
Well, this is where things get really interesting.
Right.
Because Jung would say that even scientific discoveries aren't immune to the influence of the unconscious.
Really?
He believed that the psyche, our mind, is the mediator of all experience.
Right.
So even when we're engaged in the most rational scientific pursuits, there's always this unconscious element at play.
Okay.
And he even suggests that archetypes, those universal patterns of thought and behavior, could be influencing breakthroughs in science.
Wow. So you're saying that, like, archetypes could be shaping scientific progress?
In a way, yes.
It's a pretty bold claim.
It is, but think about it.
Okay.
Think about Robert Mayer's discovery of the conservation of energy or the development of the atomic model. Even Kekule's famous dream.
Right, where the snake bites its tail.
Exactly.
And that gives him the idea for the structure of benzene.
That's the one.
Yeah.
These aha moments, these flashes of insight. Jung would say that they might have roots in the collective unconscious.
Interesting. Okay.
The realm of archetypes.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Like, we're saying that archetypes could be at work behind the scenes, influencing these scientific discoveries.
That's a fascinating possibility.
It is fascinating, but it also raises so many questions for me.
Of course.
Like, if these archetypes are so influential, why can't we see them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like they're physical objects.
Right.
You can't measure an archetype.
No, you can't put it under a microscope.
Right.
Jung actually compares archetypes to the electron in physics.
Okay.
We can't directly observe an electron,
Right.
but we can infer its existence through its effects,
Okay.
through its interactions with other particles. Similarly, archetypes are, by their nature, unconscious. They can't be directly observed, even with the most advanced technology.
Okay.
We only see their influence indirectly.
So through
Our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors.
Okay, so how do these archetypes, if we can't see them,
Right.
how do they actually manifest in our lives?
Well, think about some of the classic Jungian archetypes.
Yeah.
You have the shadow,
Okay.
the anima animus, the wise old man.
Mm-hmm.
These are all examples of archetypes that Jung believed reside within us.
Okay. And do any of those resonate with you personally?
I mean, they all have a certain mystery to them, don't they?
Yeah, for sure.
But I think the idea of the shadow self is particularly intriguing.
Yeah. What exactly does he mean by that?
It's like this hidden, darker side of ourselves.
Okay.
The part of us that we might not want to acknowledge.
Right.
The impulses and desires that we try to keep hidden.
Okay.
But Jung would say that the shadow is just as much a part of us as our conscious personality.
So it's not like it's
not something to be feared, but
Right.
something to be understood
Yeah.
and integrated.
And how about these
Mm-hmm.
complexes, these archetypal energies?
Right.
How do they play out? Do they control us?
That's a great question.
Like, do we have any agency, or are we just puppets of these archetypes?
Well, Jung believed that they could have a powerful influence on us,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes even feeling like they take on a life of their own.
Really?
He actually points to figures like Christ and Hitler
Wow.
as examples of individuals who might have been deeply influenced by these archetypal forces.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It is.
Christ and Hitler both shaped by archetypes.
It's a provocative thought, isn't it?
It is, but doesn't that then suggest that everything is explained by archetypes?
That's a common criticism of Jung.
Is it?
Yeah, people say, oh, so archetypes explain everything.
Right.
What about individual responsibility?
Right.
What about free will?
Yeah, exactly.
But Jung was careful to differentiate archetypes from personal complexes,
Oh, okay.
which are unique to our individual experiences.
Right.
He also emphasized the importance of individual development.
Okay.
It's not like we're just robots programmed by these archetypes.
Right.
We have the capacity to make choices
Okay, good.
to shape our own destinies.
Okay, so then if these archetypes are universal,
Right.
how do we explain the fact that cultures are so different?
That's a great question.
Shouldn't there be more consistency if we all share this same underlying structure?
Well, Jung addressed this in his later work.
Did he?
He came to believe that while the archetypes themselves might be universal,
Mm-hmm.
cultural influences shape how those archetypes are expressed.
Okay.
It's like the same musical note played on different instruments.
Oh.
The essence of the note is the same,
Right.
but the sound is unique to each instrument.
So it's like each culture is playing their own version of the
Exactly.
same song, kind of.
It's a beautiful analogy, isn't it?
Yeah.
The underlying structure might be the same, but the expression is culturally specific.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So can you give us a specific example?
Sure, there's a fascinating example from Jung's own autobiography.
Oh.
He describes a patient who had this vision
Mm-hmm.
of the sun's phallus being the source of the wind.
Okay.
Now, that might sound bizarre at first glance,
Mm-hmm.
but Jung points out that this same motif
Yeah.
actually appears in ancient Mithraic rituals.
Oh, wow.
So even though the imagery might seem strange or unfamiliar,
Right.
there's this deeper archetypal connection.
Right, that transcends the specific cultural context.
Exactly.
Okay, so then how do we address the question of scientific validity?
Right, because that's the big one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can we really consider these connections to be more than just coincidence?
Right.
How do we even begin to study these archetypes scientifically?
Right, because they're so subjective and slippery.
They are, and that's a challenge that Jung himself grappled with.
And couldn't you argue that these cultural parallels are simply the result of stories and symbols spreading from one culture to another?
You could, and that's a point that critics often raise.
Right.
But to understand how Jung addressed this, we need to look at his later ideas,
Okay.
and specifically the concept of gene-culture coevolution.
Okay, so gene culture coevolution.
It's a mouthful, I know.
It is?
But it's a really important idea
Okay.
that might help us understand how archetypes work.
All right, so let's dive into that then.
Let's do it.
Okay. Okay, so we're talking about gene culture coevolution. It
Yeah.
sounds like a pretty complex idea.
It is. It's basically the idea that certain genes might predispose us
Okay.
to certain cultural behaviors, and then those behaviors in turn can influence which genes get passed on.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like this two-way street between our biology and our culture.
Okay, so it's not just nature versus nurture, right?
Right. It's more like a dance between the two.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
A dance.
Yeah, they're influencing each other.
So are there any thinkers who are kind of the forefront of this?
Yeah, one of the leading thinkers in this area is Edward O. Wilson.
Okay.
And he argues that even complex things like religion and morality could be influenced by our genes.
Okay, but how does that even work?
Well, think about something like music.
Okay.
Humans seem to have this innate predisposition for music, right?
Yeah.
We love music,
Yeah.
but the specific genres we enjoy,
Right.
the instruments we prefer, those are all shaped by the culture we grow up in.
Mm-hmm.
What if certain genes made us more sensitive to certain rhythms or melodies? And over time, those genes might become more common
Right.
in cultures where that kind of music is prevalent.
Oh, interesting.
So you can see how it's not just genes determining everything,
Right.
but they're creating this kind of predisposition.
Right, that then interacts with the environment.
Exactly.
Okay, and so how does that apply to
Jung.
Yeah, to Jung and archetypes?
Well, you could argue that we might be genetically predisposed
Okay.
to be receptive to certain archetypal patterns. And that this predisposition then influences how those archetypes are expressed in our culture.
So it's like the genes are providing the canvas.
In a way, yes.
And then culture is painting the picture.
It's a very simplified analogy, but I think it captures the basic idea.
It does. And it's fascinating to think
Yeah,
that there might be this deep-seated reason why certain myths and symbols resonate across cultures.
Mm-hmm. It's like there's something in us
Yeah.
that's drawn to these universal stories.
Okay, so, and I know Jung faced some criticism, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Particularly from the scientific community.
Yeah, his ideas weren't exactly met with open arms by everyone.
Why is that?
Well, one of the biggest challenges was the question of scientific validity.
Okay.
Critics argued that his ideas were too vague,
Right.
too mystical, too difficult to test empirically.
Right. You can't exactly put an archetype under a microscope.
I can't measure it in a lab.
So how did Jung respond to that?
Well, he acknowledged that the psyche, by its very nature, couldn't be studied in the same way as the physical world.
Okay.
But that didn't make it any less real.
Okay.
He pointed to his clinical work, the experiences of his patients, as a form of evidence.
And what have you seen?
In his practice.
Yeah.
Well, he noticed that many of his patients, regardless of their cultural backgrounds,
Okay.
reported dreams, visions, fantasies that contained similar archetypal imagery,
Really?
even if they had no prior knowledge of mythology
Wow.
or Jung's work.
So it was like these archetypes
We were bubbling up from the unconscious,
Yeah.
expressing themselves in these symbolic forms.
Wow. And that was regardless of culture, regardless of background.
It seemed to be this universal phenomenon.
Okay, so Jung saw that as evidence.
He did.
That these archetypes weren't just learned.
Right.
They were somehow innate.
Potentially even rooted in our biology.
And that probably ruffled some feathers, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, even today,
Yeah.
Jung's theory is not universally accepted. But I think it's important to remember that even without complete scientific validation, his ideas can offer a valuable framework for understanding ourselves and the world.
Okay, so what's the takeaway?
For the listener.
Yeah, why should we care?
About these ancient myths.
Yeah, about these hidden patterns.
Well, Jung believed that becoming aware of these archetypes could be a powerful tool for self-understanding.
Okay.
It's like having a map of our inner landscape.
Oh, okay.
It helps us navigate our own thoughts, feelings, reactions.
So it's not about believing
Right.
in these archetypes as literal beings.
No, it's not about taking myths literally.
Okay.
It's about recognizing their psychological significance.
Okay, so give me an example.
Okay, so let's say you're struggling with your shadow,
Okay.
right? Recognizing that archetype could help you understand your darker impulses, the tendencies you might not want to admit to.
Okay.
Or maybe you're having trouble in your relationships. Understanding the animus could shed light on how you relate to the opposite sex.
Okay, so it helps us make sense
It can, yeah.
of our experiences.
It's about recognizing that these archetypes aren't just abstract concepts.
Right.
They're living forces that influence us.
Okay, so if we buy into this idea that understanding these archetypes can help us,
Right.
how do we tap into them?
Well, that's where things get a little trickier.
Okay.
Jung didn't offer a simple step-by-step guide to uncovering your archetypes.
Oh, okay.
He believed it was a process of exploration and discovery, often requiring the help of a skilled therapist.
Oh, so it's not something you can just...
It's not a DIY project.
Right.
It's not like you can just read a few books.
Or take an online quiz.
And suddenly you've got it all figured out.
Right, okay.
Jungian therapy is a deep dive.
Into the unconscious.
Into the unconscious. It involves things like dream analysis, active imagination, all with the guidance of a trained professional.
Okay, so that sounds pretty involved.
It can be, yes.
But are there things we can do in our daily lives?
Oh, absolutely.
To start becoming more aware?
Yeah, paying attention to our dreams is a great place to start.
Okay.
Jung saw dreams as this direct line. To the unconscious, they often reveal archetypal imagery.
Okay, so if I have a dream about flying,
Right.
that could be telling me something about the hero archetype.
It could be, or it could be about something completely different.
Right.
Dream interpretation is complex.
Okay.
It's best not to jump to conclusions.
Right.
But the more we pay attention to our dreams, the more likely we are to notice recurring themes.
Okay.
Symbols that could point to underlying archetypal influences.
And what about those moments when we feel inexplicably drawn to a particular story, myth, or work of art?
Yeah, that's another clue.
Could that be an archetype trying to get our attention?
Jung believed it could be.
Really?
He saw these synchronicities, these meaningful coincidences, potential expressions of archetypes at work.
Okay, so if I keep finding myself drawn to stories about transformation, that might be worth exploring.
It might be the hero archetype.
Okay.
Calling out to you.
So it's about being open.
It is.
To the possibility.
To the possibility that there's these deeper layers of meaning at play in our lives.
Okay, I like that.
And that these archetypes might be trying to communicate with us.
In these subtle ways.
In these subtle ways.
Okay, so Jung's theory invites us to become explorers of our own inner worlds.
It does.
To pay attention to the whispers of the unconscious and to be open to the possibility that these archetypal patterns
are shaping our lives in ways we might not even realize.
In ways we might not even realize, okay?
And that exploration, that journey of self-discovery, can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves.
Okay.
Our place in the world, the nature of reality itself.
That sounds like a pretty good payoff.
It's a journey worth taking.
It is a journey worth taking. And, but that journey, like any good story, needs a resolution.
It does.
To understand how Jung saw the potential of archetypes to guide us toward wholeness, we'll need to delve a little deeper.
Let's do it.
We've been on quite the journey, exploring these archetypes.
We have.
They seem to be lurking in the shadows, whispering to us through dreams, myths, even our daily experiences.
Right.
But how do we know they're not just figments of our imagination?
Right. How do we know they're real?
Yeah. How did Jung himself grapple with this question?
Well, Jung, despite his emphasis on the unconscious, was a scientist at heart.
Okay.
He wasn't content to simply accept archetypes on faith.
So he wasn't just saying, trust me, these things exist.
No, he wanted evidence. He wanted to understand their nature, their influence on us.
Okay, so how did he go about doing that?
Well, one way was by looking for evidence of them in the wider world.
Didn't he look at recurring patterns across cultures?
Exactly. He was struck by how certain myths, symbols, motifs, show up again and again in cultures separated by vast distances in time.
Yeah, like the hero's journey.
The hero's journey is a perfect example.
Right, it's told and retold.
In countless forms.
Yeah, but couldn't you say that that's just cultural diffusion?
You could.
Like ideas spreading.
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
But Jung felt that diffusion alone couldn't explain the depth and consistency of these patterns.
Okay.
He believed they pointed to something more fundamental.
Okay, to something inherent to the human psyche.
Exactly.
And didn't he also draw on his clinical work?
He did. The experiences of his patients.
Right, as evidence.
He observed that many of his patients, regardless of their background, describe dreams, visions, fantasies with similar archetypal imagery.
Even if they had no prior knowledge.
Even if they had no prior knowledge of mythology or his theories.
Wow.
It was like these archetypes were surfacing in their unconscious.
Uninfluenced by their personal history or culture?
Seemingly so.
Wow, so Jung saw this as further evidence.
He did.
That archetypes weren't simply learned, but somehow innate.
Potentially even rooted in our biology.
Okay, so I can see how this would be a tough sell for some people.
Oh, absolutely. Not everyone buys into this.
Right.
Especially those who are skeptical of the unconscious.
Right.
Or who see the mind primarily as a product of experience.
So where does that leave us then if we don't fully accept Jung's theories?
I think even if we don't subscribe to every detail, Jung's work encourages us to consider the possibility that there are these universal patterns of human experience, patterns that transcend individual cultures and historical periods.
So it challenges us to look beyond the surface.
It does.
To delve into the hidden depths of the psyche.
To consider that we might be connected to something larger than ourselves.
Yeah, to this collective unconscious.
That binds us together.
Across time and space.
Exactly. And that's where I think the real power of Jung's ideas lies. He believed that by becoming aware of these archetypes, by integrating them into our conscious lives, we could move towards wholeness, towards a more authentic and fulfilling experience of ourselves and the world.
So it's not just about understanding them intellectually. It's about actually working with them.
It's about embodying them.
Integrating them into our lives.
Exactly. And for Jung, this was the ultimate goal of individuation.
And how do we begin to do that?
Well, Jung believed that engaging with our dreams, exploring myths and stories that resonate with us, reflecting on the patterns that emerge in our lives. These are all ways to connect with these archetypal energies.
So it's about paying attention
to the whispers of the unconscious. Noticing where these patterns show up in our relationships, our work, our creative pursuits.
So it's an ongoing process.
It is a process of exploration and discovery.
And it doesn't end with this deep dive.
It doesn't. It continues with each dream you explore, each myth that speaks to you, each moment when you sense something ancient and profound stirring within.
It's been an incredible journey into the world of Carl Jung.
It has.
Thank you for guiding us through this fascinating and complex landscape.
It's been my pleasure, and remember, the exploration of the psyche is a lifelong adventure.
It is.
And as Jung himself said, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed.
Wow, that's a good one.
It is. And so may this deep dive continue to transform you as you embark on your own journey of self-discovery.
That's great. Thanks again.
Thank you.